History is often decided long before swords clash or arrows fly. It is decided in moments of arrogance, when power becomes so overwhelming that caution feels unnecessary. Empires rarely fall because they are weak. They fall because they laugh at the wrong enemy. This is the story of a single insult, scribbled by a victorious empire in the year 722 AD. An insult aimed at a handful of starving men hiding in a cave. An insult that would echo through centuries, ignite the Reconquista, and expose how even the mightiest war machine can be undone by contempt. Imagine yourself in the year 722 AD. You are a general of the Umayyad Caliphate, serving an empire that seems unstoppable. In barely a decade, your armies have surged out of Arabia, crossed deserts, seas, and mountains, and reached the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. Kingdoms have fallen in weeks. Cities have surrendered without a fight. Resistance has collapsed so quickly that war has begun to feel routine. Then a report reaches your desk. It speaks of a small group of rebels hiding in the cold mountains of northern Spain. They live in caves. They are hungry. Your scouts say they survive by scraping honey from rocks. There is no city to besiege, no army to confront. You laugh. You pick up your quill and write words that history will never forgive. You dismiss them as 30 wild donkeys. You ask your officers a careless question. What harm can 30 wild donkeys possibly do to us? That question becomes your death sentence. Because those donkeys are about to draw your army into a narrow mountain valley called Covadonga, a place where imperial confidence will shatter and where the dream of total conquest in Europe will quietly die. To understand how such a mistake was possible, we must understand the speed of the Umayyad advance. This was not a slow imperial expansion. It was a lightning strike. In 711 AD, Muslim forces crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and what followed was not a war, it was a collapse. At the Battle of Guadalete, the Visigothic kingdom destroyed itself in a single afternoon. The king vanished. The generals died. The nobility betrayed one another. When the dust settled, there was no command structure left to resist. For the Umayyad commanders, Spain was no longer a battlefield. It was a vacuum. They swept north like wildfire. Toledo fell. Seville fell. Córdoba fell. City after city opened its gates. The speed was intoxicating. By the time the invaders reached the northern coast, they were convinced that divine favor marched with them. They had crossed seas and deserts. Why fear wet mountains and fog? That arrogance gave birth to the insult. It was not just mockery, it was calculation. Chroniclers record how Umayyad officials examined the map and saw only a tiny pocket of resistance hidden in the jagged Picos de Europa. Sending a full army into those narrow passes would be expensive and inconvenient. Winter would kill the rebels. Hunger would finish the rest. If they want to live like animals in caves, the thinking went, let them die there. But the empire made a fatal mistake. It counted numbers, 300 men against an empire of millions, but ignored identity. These were not peasants with farm tools. They were survivors of the Visigothic royal guard. Hardened veterans who had watched their world burn and retreated to terrain where cavalry could not follow. And they were led by a man who did not want to survive. He wanted revenge. His name was Pelayo. History repeats this error endlessly. Napoleon made it in Russia. America made it in Vietnam. Superpowers search for armies. When they don't see one, they assume there is no threat. The Umayyads looked for open plains where cavalry could dominate. They found none and assumed the war was over. So they left the north alone. And by doing so, they gave Pelayo the one weapon he needed more than any blade: time. Time to organize. Time to learn every ridge and ravine. Time to turn refugees into an ambush force. While Umayyad officials collected taxes and planned campaigns beyond the Pyrenees, Pelayo was transforming the Covadonga Valley into a trap. The irony is merciless. A single serious expedition in 718 or 719 could have crushed the rebellion in an afternoon. The Reconquista might never have begun. Spain's future could have been rewritten entirely. But the empire was too successful to care. When the order finally came in 722 to eliminate the rebels, it was already too late. The Umayyad commander marched north, expecting a routine operation. He expected surrender, not resistance. He did not realize he was walking into a geological prison. He did not know that the wild donkeys had spent years sharpening their hooves. To understand the men in that cave, we must understand what they had lost. The fall of Visigothic Spain was not just a conquest, it was a suicide. The kingdom had rotted from within, consumed by civil wars, assassinations, and power struggles. Kings rose and fell by betrayal, not succession. Pelayo witnessed it all, a nobleman and royal guardsman. He saw his king vanish at Guadalete, watched his country dissolve, and refused to submit. Captured and taken to Cordoba as a hostage, he waited. When the conquerors attempted to erase his bloodline through political marriage, something broke. In 717, he escaped. He did not flee to safety. He ran back into danger, back to the mountains. Villagers followed him. Dispossessed nobles followed him. Young men raised under occupation followed him. In mud and stone, they declared him prince, not of a kingdom, but of resistance. The Umayyads laughed again, and then they waited. For 4 years, Pelayo prepared. He stockpiled weapons. He studied terrain. He waited for the empire to grow impatient. And when it finally marched into Covadonga, confident and careless, Pelayo did not meet it in the open. He welcomed it inside and slammed the door shut. Look at a topographical map of Spain, and the mystery of the Reconquista begins to dissolve. The heart of the peninsula is a vast, dry plateau, open, flat, and ideal for the movement of large armies. Empires thrive there. Cavalry dominates. Control is easy. But the north is a different world. The northern edge of Spain is not shaped by politics, but by tectonic violence. The Picos de Europa, the peaks of Europe, rise violently from the sea in jagged walls of limestone, forming a maze of cliffs, ravines, and narrow valleys. This is not terrain made for horses. It is terrain made for goats. And the weather is as hostile as the rock. Atlantic winds crash into the mountains, generating relentless rain, fog, and sudden snowstorms. 4 Umayyad soldiers raised under desert skies or North African sun, marching into Asturias felt like stepping onto an alien planet. To understand the tactical brilliance of Pelayo, you must understand the ground he chose for his stand, Covadonga. The name comes from Cova Dominica, the cave of the lady. It is a natural limestone overhang carved into a sheer cliff, looming above a narrow valley where 2 rivers meet. Geographically, it is a dead end. To reach the cave, an army must funnel itself through a wooded gorge so tight that formations collapse before fighting even begins. In military terms, this is a force multiplier. The Umayyad army under General Alcama was enormous by medieval standards. Christian chronicles inflate its size to 80,000 or even 180,000 men. Modern historians suggest a more realistic figure, perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 effective soldiers. But the number didn't matter. Whether Alcama had 10,000 men or 10 million, only a few could fight at once. The valley was too narrow. The rest became useless weight, bodies pressed against bodies, trapped by stone. People often compare Covadonga to Thermopylae, but Covadonga was even worse for the attacker. At Thermopylae, the Persians eventually flanked the Spartans. Here, there was no flank, only cliff on one side, river on the other. The Umayyad advantage vanished the moment they entered the gorge. Their greatest strengths, heavy cavalry and massed archery, were rendered nearly useless. Horses slipped, panicked, and broke their legs on jagged stone. And the cave itself neutralized archers through pure geometry. To fire into the cave, arrows had to be shot steeply upward, missed by inches, and the projectile slammed into stone. And stone does not forgive. Pelayo was not hiding. He was baiting. By placing himself in the cave, he invited Alcima to reach in and crush what looked like a trapped animal. He was gambling everything on imperial arrogance. He knew they would not respect the terrain. He knew they would underestimate desperation. In the spring of 722, the Umayyad army marched into the valley. With them came Bishop Appas, a Visigothic noble turned churchman who had aligned himself with the conquerors. His presence was political theater. Before steel was drawn, Alcima tried persuasion. Appas rode forward on a mule, draped in clerical authority, and called up to the cave. Chroniclers, especially the Chronicle of Alfonso III, record the exchange. While we should be cautious with reconstructed dialogue, the message is unmistakable. Appas appealed to reason. He reminded Pelayo that the entire Visigothic kingdom had collapsed, that every great city had fallen, that resistance was futile. He offered survival, wealth, authority under Umayyad rule. Why die for a kingdom already buried? It was a powerful argument. Pelayo's response reshaped history. He did not answer with numbers or threats. He answered with faith and defiance. Quoting scripture, he declared that the Church of God was like a mustard seed, small, insignificant, yet destined to grow beyond all expectation. From this little mountain, he proclaimed, the salvation of Spain would rise. Appas understood then that words had failed. He turned back and delivered a grim message to Alcima. Pelayo would not surrender. Battle was inevitable. The general reportedly sneered. To him, the rebels looked like targets, not prophets. The signal was given. Umayyad slingers and archers moved forward, launching volleys meant to suppress the cave while infantry advanced. It was a tactic that had worked countless times. But Covadonga was no ordinary siege. The cave was a shallow overhang. Arrows struck stone at sharp angles and rebounded. They shattered. They ricocheted. They fell back into the packed ranks below. Medieval chroniclers called it divine intervention. Modern physics calls it inevitability. Panic spread through the front line as soldiers were struck by their own missiles. Confusion rippled through the gorge. And in that moment, when the giant blinked, Pelayo struck. From the cave mouth, from the trees, from the fog-shrouded ridges, the Asturians poured down like a landslide. This was not a disciplined charge. It was fury unleashed. Swords, axes, spears, and stones slammed into a stunned enemy. But the cave fighters were only the trigger. High above, hidden in mist, villagers and refugees had prepared the true weapon. For days, they had loosened boulders and stacked logs along the cliffs. At Pelayo's signal, the mountains themselves attacked. Rock and timber thundered into the gorge. There was nowhere to run. The Umayyad army was packed shoulder to shoulder, hemmed in by stone walls. The rear continued pushing forward, unaware of the disaster ahead. The front tried to flee backward. The result was crushing chaos. Men were trampled by horses. Banners vanished. Command disintegrated. General Alcima tried to rally his forces, but a commander in a gorge is just another man. He was cut down amid the carnage, killed by the very wild donkeys he had dismissed. With his death, the army's spine snapped. The survivors broke and ran, but escape was just as deadly. Debris blocked their path. The valley became a slaughterhouse. This was not a battle. It was annihilation. By midday, the invincible army was gone. Those who escaped fled east into the mountains, believing the worst was behind them. They were wrong. The retreat led them through treacherous passes toward Libana and then into disaster once more. Near Cangas de Onis, the mountains claimed their final toll. Whether from rain, vibration, or sheer weight, entire slopes collapsed. The earth itself gave way. The chronicles describe it as apocalyptic. The mountain fell, burying men, horses, and weapons in a roaring avalanche of stone. For Pelayo, standing amid the wreckage, this was not the end but the beginning. The wild donkeys had kicked back. and Europe would never forget it. The mountain came down on them. Stone, earth, and timber collapsed in a roaring avalanche, crushing men and horses alike, burying them where they stood. Medieval chronicles claim that 63,000 soldiers died that day, a number almost certainly exaggerated, as was common in medieval writing. But the exact figure no longer matters. What matters is the truth beneath the myth. The army did not retreat. It did not regroup. It ceased to exist. To Christian chroniclers, this was the unmistakable hand of God. Just as the Red Sea had closed over Pharaoh's chariots, the Picos de Europa had closed over the Umayyads. The land itself had risen in judgment. The mountains had chosen side. From a modern perspective, the explanation is brutally simple. A routed army unfamiliar with mountainous terrain, forced on an unstable limestone during the wet season, is walking into a natural execution. Panic, weight, vibration, and rain turned the slopes into weapons. The devastation was absolute. The river Deva was reportedly dammed by debris and bodies, forming a grotesque barrier that took days to clear. This moment at Kiskaya transformed defeat into annihilation. Had even a fraction of those soldiers escaped, they could have limped back south, warned Cordoba, regrouped, and returned the following summer with caution and maps. But no one returned. General Alcama's expedition vanished into silence. For the Umayyad governors in the south, that silence must have been terrifying. An army marched north and was never heard from again. No messengers, no wounded survivors, no explanations. The wild donkeys had not merely bitten the lion. They had devoured it. From that moment on, the mountains of Asturias were no longer dismissed as insignificant backwater. They were curse ground, a graveyard. The Umayyad military, pragmatic above all else, recalculated the cost. Raids would continue, but permanent conquest was abandoned. The price was simply too high. That single landslide bought Pelayo something more valuable than gold: security. A border, unwritten, unmarked, was drawn between the Islamic south and the Christian north. Behind that invisible line, the tiny seed of resistance was allowed to grow undisturbed. Back at Covadonga, the immediate danger had passed. But Pelayo understood something essential. Winning a battle does not create a kingdom. Survival requires removing every loose end. One remained, Governor Menuza. While the Umayyad army was being buried in the mountains, Menuza sat in his palace at Gijón, waiting for news. He expected triumph. Instead, he received whispers. Survivors arrived wide-eyed and trembling, speaking of mountains collapsing, of soldiers crushed, of an enemy that could not be killed. Menuza understood instantly. The wind had changed. The countryside that once obeyed him now looked at him with something far more dangerous than fear: hope. Gijón, a coastal city, was indefensible against fighters who controlled the highlands. If he stayed, he would be trapped. So Menuza fled. He gathered his treasury, his guard, and if she was still in his possession, Pelayo's sister, and ran south toward the open plateau where Umayyad cavalry still ruled. But Pelayo was no longer merely a rebel. He was a hunter. Moving faster through familiar valleys, the Asturians intercepted Menuza at Olalis. What followed was not a battle. It was an ending. History disagrees on the details, whether Menuza fell fighting or was captured and executed, but the result is certain. Menuza died on the road, fleeing a land he thought he owned. With Alcama buried and Menuza dead, Asturias was cleared. Not a single Umayyad combat unit remained. In a matter of weeks, a band of refugees had annihilated an expeditionary army and decapitated provincial rule. When the rebels gathered again, perhaps in the same field near Kangas where they had once plotted in fear, the atmosphere had changed. They were no longer fugitives. They were victors. Following ancient Visigothic custom, the warriors raised Pelayo on a shield, lifting him above their heads and proclaiming him king. There was no cathedral, no crown, no blessing from Rome, only battered armor and scarred hands. Thus was born the kingdom of Asturias. Tiny, poor, surrounded by enemies, but free. Pelayo, once a hostage in Córdoba, became the first independent Christian king in Iberia since 711. He ruled from Cangas de Onís, not a city of marble, but a place that belonged to him. This coronation sent shockwaves far beyond the mountains. The Umayyads, reeling from catastrophe, designated Asturias as Dar al-Harb, hostile territory not worth the blood required to conquer. Their attention turned north into France, a decision that would lead to another defeat at Tours a decade later. Pelayo ruled for 15 more years and died peacefully in 737, a rare fate for a man who defied an empire. But his true legacy was not his crown. It was the system he left behind. Asturias survived because its rulers learned a brutal truth. They could not defend open land. So they defended emptiness. Under Pelayo's successors, especially Alfonso I, the Duero basin was deliberately emptied. Towns were burned, populations moved north, fields abandoned. A desert was created. Any Umayyad army marching north now faced hundreds of miles of wasteland, no food, no water, no shelter before ever reaching the mountains. Exhausted and starving, they became perfect prey. Behind this buffer, Asturias grew. Laws were written. Churches rose like fortresses. A new identity formed, one that saw itself as the heir of Rome and the Visigoths. While empires fought elsewhere, this small kingdom incubated. By the 9th century, it was no longer hiding. It pushed south. Its capital moved to Oviedo. The Reconquista had shifted from survival to expansion. This is the true miracle of Covadonga. Not that 300 men won a battle, but that they bought time for a nation to be born. Without Pelayo, there is no Asturias. Without Asturias, no Leon, no Castile, no Portugal, no Spain. And without Spain, there is number 1492, no Isabella, no Columbus. The modern world pivots on that rainy afternoon in a mountain cave. Pelayo did not know this. He fought for his home. But history followed him. The war he began would last nearly 8 centuries, the longest conflict in human history. When Granada fell in 1492, the victors did not see it as conquest. They saw it as completion. Today, the cave of Covadonga remains. Silent, sacred. Inside rests a simple tomb. The inscription reads that here lies the man who began a new reign from ashes. A fitting end. Pelayo was never a man of palaces. He was a man of the mountains. And he reminds us that history is not always shaped by empires. Sometimes it is shaped by those who, backed into a corner, look at impossible odds and refuse to kneel. If even one mustard seed survives, the story is not over.